Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Witch's Door, Oddities and Tales from the Esoteric to the Extreme, by Ryan Matthew Cohn and Regina M. Rossi. Narrated by Ryan Matthew Cohn and Regina M. Rossi. To all the black sheep who have always felt out of step. Warning: you are about to enter a realm of the strange and unusual. This death-positive compendium of oddities and curiosities represents our lifelong fascination with the macabre and the bizarre. While some will find these artifacts to be an affront to good manners and common decency, we see great beauty in the journey our bodies take long after life deserts us. Some of the artifacts you will encounter in this book stretch the limits of credulity. Others are simply shocking. We present them to you with the assurance of our respect for the dead and our gratitude for all they have taught us. Also, this book may or may not be haunted. Enter at your own risk. Prologue: The Witch's Door. Old Jeff, Ryan and Regina. The first time we laid eyes on the Witch's Door, we knew it was something special. We just acquired the collection of a friend whom we'll call Nick Parmesan. He was given the moniker because his parents ran a neighborhood deli in Brooklyn that made the best chicken parmesan known to humankind. Nick was an odd guy. He was a former New York Police Department sergeant who took early leave from the force after 9/11. Some people travel when they retire. Others go to the beach. Nick caught the collecting bug. He did a lot of his collecting online, but he was also a fixture at many of the flea markets and antique shops where we did business. All collectors are secretive, but Nick took it to an extreme and had many enemies. Despite some ups and downs in our long relationship, we considered Nick a friend. He was also a hoarder. We'd only been to Nick's apartment in Brooklyn a handful of times. Although he was proud of his collection, he didn't like people poking around his stuff. Nick had an incredible eye, but his collection was a mess. It was so vast and disorganized that he didn't have a way to display it. We didn't realize how serious his hoarding problem had become until after he had passed away. There was no other way to put this. Nick's apartment was a horror show. Boxes and bags were piled up all over the place. The stacks rose from the floor and went all the way up to the ceiling. The place was dark and dangerous and in disrepair. Walking from one room to the next was an adventure because each step required moving piles of Nick's stuff out of the way. These obstacles aside, Nick's collection was jaw-dropping. We couldn't believe the quality of the stuff he had in there. Suits of armor, a squad of skeletons, exquisite 18th century Italian figures. Amid the towers of garbage and junk, we found unusual sculptures, boxes of teeth, and antiquities rare enough to be displayed in a museum. When we acquired Nick's collection, we agreed to clear out his apartment so that it would be ready for the new occupants to rent. As is usually the case in situations where someone passes away unexpectedly, we didn't have much time to prepare for the cleanup, and everything had to go. We rented some trucks and enlisted the aid of a full-scale crew, but towards the end of the first day, we had to face the truth. We'd underestimated the amount of stuff that Nick had crammed inside of his apartment. We'd barely made a dent in it, and we were completely overwhelmed. As we were getting ready to leave for the day, something caught our attention. We couldn't tell what it was, but it looked like a piece of antique furniture. At first, we thought it was a headboard, but it was far too big for that. After shifting some boxes around, we noticed what looked like a rough wooden door with hand-forged wrought iron hardware leaning against the wall. It was massive. That's what caught our attention, but there was too much stuff in front of it to get a good look. Now that our curiosity was piqued, we needed to know exactly what we were looking at. We kept moving things around until we could see a piece properly. It was definitely a door, and it wasn't in very good condition. The wood was scratched and scarred. It was obviously very old. Although it was far from beautiful, there was something about the door that called to us. It was getting late and becoming dark inside the apartment. Our bodies ached from moving Nick's belongings around all day. We were positive we had never seen this object in his apartment or heard him talk about it before, which meant one of two things. Either he'd acquired it recently or he'd kept it hidden from us. Why would he do that? We didn't always understand Nick's impulses, but we trusted his taste. We knew it had to be something. Once we brought the antique out to the light, we noticed something very unusual. In the upper part of the door, someone had carved a figure into the wood. This wasn't a decorative detail. The carving was ugly and crude, but because it had faded with time, it was also easy to miss in the gloom of Nick's apartment. The door had been defaced with the carving of an image of a sinister-looking woman. Above the figure, the words Old Jeff had been inscribed, which was an Old English term for the devil. This carving had been made as a warning to others. Old Jeff lives here, a she-devil, a witch. We looked at each other in amazement. What the hell had Nick found? Chapter 1. The Exploded Skull. Skulls of the Forest, Ryan. I've always been fascinated with death. When I was a little kid, I'd wander around the woods behind my house. I grew up in upstate Maine and loved to go exploring in nature. I would find all kinds of fascinating natural specimens, bird feathers, dead beetles, animal bones. Instead of just admiring these objects, I felt compelled to keep them. I would bring them home with me and put them in various boxes that I kept under my bed. Sometimes I'd drag my specimens out of their hiding place and lay them out onto the floor so I could look at them. To someone from the city or suburbs, this might seem a little creepy, but I was fascinated with nature. When you live in a rural area, death is a part of the natural cycle of life. My interest in dead things wasn't considered strange or odd by my parents or friends, though my little sister was a bit creeped out by the stuff she'd find when she went snooping in my room. It was a fairly normal part of growing up in the woods. I was only 5 or 6 years old, but I was already creating my own little world underneath my bed. My parents had a pretty significant library, and one of my favorite books was an encyclopedia that had detailed diagrams of human anatomy. It started with the skeletal system, and then I'd turn the page, which was completely clear, and lay the muscular system on top of it. The next page had the vascular system with all the blood vessels, and then the nervous system came next. In this manner, I could put together the human body so I could see what we looked like underneath our skin. I was obsessed with these diagrams of the body. Flipping back and forth through the pages was like watching someone decompose and then spring back to life. Mostly I used the book as reference for my drawings. I'd slide the book off its shelf and keep it in my room. My mom was always yelling at me, "Hey, there's an encyclopedia missing." When I admitted to having it, she'd tell me to put it back, and I would, only to bring the book back up to my room again a week or two later. My parents didn't worry about me or think I was a weirdo, even though I was holed up in my room drawing skeletons all the time or foraging through the woods looking for specimens. I wasn't mean or cruel. I was always very compassionate with creatures big and small. I didn't have a violent bone in my body. In fact, I was afraid of the dark and profoundly claustrophobic, and I remain so to this day. My parents thought my fascination with anatomy and death was a good thing. Maybe little Ryan will become a doctor. I think that was their hope, at least early on. They were definitely supportive. I found out many years later that my interest in this stuff was neither strange nor unique. There was a huge group of people out there who loved natural history as much as I did. I just hadn't found them yet. When I was about 12 years old, I started to make things. It was a natural extension of my interest in anatomy and in the objects I found in the woods. I'd make little sculptures out of bones, broken dolls, and natural specimens. That's when I really started to delve into the intersection of art and anatomy. I was already making paintings and drawings, but now I was adding the things I found in the woods, arranging the materials in a particular way. I guess you could call what I was doing back then mixed media collage. But I didn't know back then that there was a name for it. Making art was just something I did because I was interested in it, and I liked the way the objects looked together. Even when I got to the point where I understood I was making art, I wasn't interested in doing anything with the pieces I created. I wasn't trying to sell these works or show them off. I just thought they looked cool, and I felt compelled to make more. As I started to refine my skills, I became interested in putting my own skeletons together, whatever that might mean. I didn't have much money, so I kept foraging in the woods, collecting all kinds of different things in hopes of being able to make art out of the materials I found. The desire to put together a complete skeleton was very strong, and I realized I wasn't going to find everything I was looking for in the forest. I needed to expand my search. As a young collector, I didn't have a lot of funds. The only resource I had was searching for images online or in the local library. I did as much research as I could. You have to keep in mind that this was during the mid-90s when the internet was still relatively new to the general public. The World Wide Web was nothing like it is today. I really had to dig deep to find something of value. I somehow stumbled upon an image of an exploded skull. I found the website of an artist who had gone to numerous natural history museums around the world and photographed various disarticulated skulls. I didn't know anything about the process for exploding a skull. All I knew was that it was incredibly attractive to me as an artist. I wanted to figure out how I could turn my specimens into something that was arresting to the eye and aesthetically appealing. I was completely taken by the beauty of exploded skulls. Most people think the human skull is made up of two bones, the cranium and the jawbone. Actually, the human skull has 22 bones. There are 8 cranial bones and 14 facial bones. An exploded skull is when you separate or disarticulate these bones at the sutures and mount them on armatures so it looks like the bones of the skull are flying away from one another. It's actually called a Bouchain skull because the process of disarticulating the human skull supposedly began with the French doctor Edmé François Chauvois de Bouchain. Although the earliest drawings of the disarticulated skull go all the way back to the 16th century via Leonardo da Vinci, it was Bouchain who actually created the first medical model of a disarticulated skull. These models were used by doctors and medical professionals to study all of the intricacies of the cranium. With a disarticulated skull, they could see a cross-section of the skull in both the interior of the cranium and the exterior of the facial bones. For the first time, the temporal bone, the occipital bone, and all of the pieces of the skull were viewable in 3 dimensions. Instead of looking at one single entity, the exploded skull made it possible to see each individual bone. My research led me into the existence of medical museums. In the 90s, most museums weren't putting their collections online. They used the internet like glorified yellow pages. I started calling up the museums I found online, asking all kinds of questions about exploded skulls. That's when I discovered the Mutter Museum at the College of Physicians of Philadelphia. Dr. Thomas Dent Mutter was a 19th century physician and surgeon who was dedicated to expanding the knowledge of medical professionals. When he died, he left his collection of medical instruments and specimens and a large sum of money for the creation of the museum. The first building was completed in 1863, and the museum has expanded over the years. Today, it has over 25,000 objects, including a few examples of Bouchain skulls. When I was in my early teens, my family moved to Woodstock in upstate New York, which made it easier for me and my 3 siblings, my older brother Sean, my younger brother Evan, and my little sister Jennifer, to take trips into New York City, where I became completely enchanted with exploded skulls. There was just one problem. The museums didn't allow guests to take photographs. I always brought my sketchbook with me, so I sat down on the floor and drew the exploded skulls on display as best I could to figure out how these things were put together. I was fascinated with the way that skulls were displayed, which is something that has stayed with me all of my life. I always pay careful attention not only to the objects in my collection, but how they are presented. A skull is a skull. Everyone knows what skulls look like. The presentation is what makes a Bouchain skull preparation beautiful and unique. Without the armature supporting the individual pieces and making them appear to be floating, all you got is a pile of bones. When it's done right, the pieces of the skull seem to hover in the air, as if by magic, providing new ways to study the cranium. This was useful for early anatomists who wanted to learn how the pieces of the skull fit together, but my obsession went deeper than that. I wanted to know how the display was constructed so that I could replicate the process myself. Before I could figure out how to put the pieces of the skull together, I had to learn how to take them apart. I found an article online from a scientist at Yale who discussed the process of disarticulating a skull, and I decided to give it a try. I printed out everything I could find about exploded skulls, which was mostly photos I'd found online. There wasn't a field guide or a YouTube tutorial for this sort of thing back then. My first attempt on a vervet monkey skull was kind of a disaster. I bought the skull online from a collector who lived in Florida. Once I had the skull ready to go, the next step was to prepare the gelatin, which is microbiological agar. It's basically no different from the Jell-O that you can buy at the store, except that it's clear and unflavored. Once the gelatin was prepared, I filled the skull with it and put it in the freezer. As the gelatin froze, it expanded, pushing the plates of the skull apart until the sutures that knit them together came loose and the bones were completely disarticulated. That was the easy part. Mounting the bones on metal armatures and putting the pieces back together was another matter. Because I didn't know what I was doing, the assembly process was incredibly time-consuming and a lot more challenging than I thought it would be. Each piece of metal had to be custom cut, drilled, and tapped so that the screw could be held securely. Every obstacle seemed insurmountable. I quickly discovered that I didn't have the right tools. It turned out there was a special holder that frees up the hands and makes this kind of work much easier. Also, the drill I was using was too big and heavy for such delicate work. It was all trial and error, and I made plenty of errors. For instance, if you drill too big of a hole in the bone or jostle the screw around too much, it becomes loose. Out of necessity, I secured the pieces that had come loose with glue. When I was done, I was disappointed with my efforts. The skull looked okay, but upon closer inspection, anyone could see that it was shabbily put together. I knew the glue wouldn't stand the test of time. I needed more practice. The next preparation I did turned out better. The second skull belonged to an adult Shakma baboon. It was slightly bigger and not as delicate as the monkey skull, but it took much more effort to pry the sutures apart. Once again, my preparation passed the eyeball test, but I was far from satisfied. Around that time, I started taking trips to New York City on my own, and I was hanging around the Evolution store on Broadway over by New York University. Evolution was known for selling antiques and anatomical specimens of the highest quality, but they also sold medical supplies, including human skulls and bones, which is legal in New York, as it is in most states. Before the advance of computers, medical students used actual skulls to study anatomy. Skulls have been a source of fascination for students, scientists, scholars, and artists for centuries. They symbolize everything we do not know about the human experience, the workings of the brain, the mystery of consciousness, and what happens to us after death. I was fortunate to get into osteological art at a time when there were strict prohibitions on the types of skulls that could be purchased. I say fortunate because it helped me understand early on that there's the right way of doing things and a wrong way. Of course, procuring skulls from graves was forbidden, and the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which was passed in 1990, protected the human remains of indigenous Americans. I'm grateful my mentors taught me to treat the skulls and skeletons of all creatures with respect and to always abide by the law. When less scrupulous collectors take shortcuts and ignore the law, they cause a great deal of harm, and the media has a tendency to paint all collectors of oddities with the same brush. I was focused on antique medical specimens, and Evolution had a beautiful 19th century French Bacchain skull on display that I had become obsessed with. The price was between $15,000 and $20,000, which seemed astronomical to me at the time. A guy named Ryan, who worked at Evolution, did all the articulations that were sold in the store. He was the expert, and he taught me a great deal. He actually let me photograph the Bacchain skull. I started asking Ryan all kinds of questions about creating exploded skulls. Ryan was patient and thorough, and he treated the artifacts under his care with the utmost respect. When he thought I was ready, he sold me a medical-grade skull of antiquity from his personal collection that had already been disarticulated. Each of the skull's bones was numbered. All I had to do was put it back together again. "Here you go," he said. "Good luck." The skull didn't cost nearly as much as it would today because there wasn't a lot of interest in articulating skulls at the time. That's no longer the case, which is partially my fault. Nevertheless, at the time a skull purchased through a company like Evolution would have cost several thousands of dollars. This was a serious investment for a young artist like me. If I cracked a piece of the skull or messed up the display, then I ruined something that cost an awful lot of money. My first human skull came out pretty well. That inspired me to keep at it. As I acquired better tools and accumulated more knowledge and experience, I began to refine my process. In the beginning, I made every single part of the armature by hand. I was basically starting from scratch with each piece. I eventually learned to cast different parts so that I didn't have to go through the process of making each individual piece. Now I can cast 4 or 5 pieces at a time, which makes the process a lot faster. It was a long, slow journey, but I was starting to figure things out. My pieces were not only beautiful to look at, but sturdy and strong. Some of the skulls I'd done in more recent years are so well put together you can drop them on the floor and they will stay intact. From skulls, I worked my way up to skeletons, which had been my ambition all along. The first skeleton I put together was a wallaby from Australia that I bought from Ryan at Evolution. He showed me the ropes and gave me some useful tips, but there's only so much you can learn without actually getting in there and doing it yourself. You learn by doing. I studied diagrams and attempted to replicate what I saw. Trying to match the sections of the vertebrae and figuring out which toe bone went where was like trying to assemble an intricate puzzle. I made some mistakes with the smaller bones, especially the really delicate ones. I thought the wallaby would be easy, but I was wrong. The finished piece looked okay, but I knew that it was deeply flawed. I kept it for a while because the wallaby was my first articulation, but it was destroyed when one of the shelves in my bedroom fell, smashing the skeleton to pieces on the floor. From that point on, I was hooked. I devoted all of my free time and energy to osteological art. That's all I did. I would save up my money, and when an antique skull or animal skeleton became available, I would buy it. I would stay up all night working on these pieces, just drinking coffee and hardly sleeping. It was really important to me to get the process right so that if an expert appraised my work, they would not only see that it looked beautiful, but that it had been done correctly. Once I was old enough to move to Brooklyn and have a little apartment of my own, I was finally able to display my pieces of art. That's when I started to think of them as a collection. I didn't have the money to buy pieces of osteological art, so I learned how to make them myself. I transformed a tiny area in my apartment into a makeshift studio where I could work on my preparations. When I was finished with a piece, I would put it on display. That's where it all started for me. When I wasn't preparing a new piece, I was conducting research on the computer or out in the field. I'd go to museums and take pictures or go to libraries and ask all kinds of questions. I would get up in the middle of the night and take the train to Manhattan from Brooklyn to go to the flea markets. I would be the first one there when they opened and would hang out waiting for vendors to put things out. Even when I didn't buy anything, those early morning excursions took my collecting to a whole new level and added to the feeling that I was on my own adventure. There wasn't one aspect of collecting that I loved more than others. I embraced all of it. The 4 flea markets that I usually went to in the city were all in roughly the same area, from around 23rd Street up to 25th Street. There was one called the Garage, and another one just outside of it where I would always find stuff. There was another market across the street, but you had to pay $1 to get into it. Then there was a derelict market around the block. It was called that because there was always drug addicts and thieves looking to sell stuff, most of which had clearly been stolen. These were the 4 big markets that were open every Saturday and Sunday. You would think that a Manhattan flea market would be a poor place to look for an animal skeleton or an osteological rarity, and you would be wrong. I found the craziest things at these markets. I went most weekends, and if I didn't go to one of these 4, there was also a market down on 11th Street and Avenue A, right near Tompkins Square Park at the basketball court. That was a neighborhood market, and you could get a table to sell for just $12. The pickings were slim there, but the prices tended to be better. I never knew what I was going to find. Many of the Lower East Side artists would sell items from their apartments at this market to make extra money. It was like a yard sale for eccentrics. There were even rumors that people would find original Robert Mapplethorpe photographs and Keith Haring paintings for very little money, and then sell those pieces at auction for millions. I figured out that I could have a great-looking oddities collection by doing many of the preparations myself. I became really intimate with the science and the know-how behind making exploded skulls and articulated skeletons look beautiful. Some collectors love acquiring things, and others obsess about possessing objects that no one else has. I like those aspects too, but for me, the best moment is when the piece is ready to put on display with the rest of my collection. For me, the presentation is the point. Otherwise, I'm just a hoarder. From the very beginning, I started to think of my little apartment as a pseudo-museum. The Czar of Cards, Ryan. Once I started collecting oddities, there was no looking back. But it wasn't my first business endeavor. I already had considerable experience buying and selling in the collectibles marketplace. When I was a kid, I was completely obsessed with baseball cards. I was fascinated by how much these little bits of cardboard were worth and why they were so valuable. I figured out that if I bought a batch of baseball cards, I could pick out the ones that were valuable and sell them for more money than I had paid for the entire lot. That was my introduction to the business side of collecting. It didn't take me long to figure out how the baseball card business worked, and I started dealing in pieces that were worth a crazy amount of money for a little kid. When I was 12 years old, I was finding Mickey Mantle rookie cards and trading tobacco cards, cards produced by the tobacco industry in the late 19th century and early 20th century. My mom would drop me off at the baseball card shop, and I would negotiate my own deals. She wouldn't even come into the store with me. I was so obsessed that my friends and family gave me baseball cards for my bar mitzvah. Baseball cards were better than cash because I could trade them for cards that were even more valuable. I kept acquiring more cards until I had a pretty substantial collection. At its peak, I had hundreds of thousands of baseball cards in my possession. My whole room was packed with boxes and boxes of cards. A family friend in Florida was also sending me autographed baseballs. He installed the water pipes at professional baseball fields and would regularly ask players for autographs. My room looked like a sports card store. The funny thing was, I absolutely hated sports, especially baseball. I had no interest in it and found the actual game incredibly boring. To this day, I have never sat through an entire baseball game. Despite my lack of interest, my parents made me play sports each year. My older brother Sean was not only the captain of the football team, but also the head of the wrestling team. As a result, one year, my father encouraged me to join the wrestling team, which I didn't want to do because I was smaller than the other kids and uninterested in athletics. During my first meet, because there weren't any other boys in my weight class, they made me wrestle a girl. I'm not exaggerating when I say she kicked the shit out of me. She even gave me a bloody lip. I remember there was a girl I liked at school, and she came to watch my match that day. Needless to say, getting my ass handed to me by a girl didn't help my chances with my crush. There was also this interesting juxtaposition between my passion for collecting baseball cards and my complete lack of interest in the sport. I didn't watch the game. I didn't have a favorite team. I didn't play it as a kid. My passion for collecting cards had nothing to do with the game itself. I believe this made me a better collector. Because I didn't have a sentimental attachment to a particular player or team, it was easier for me to let the cards go. I didn't have any hang-ups about holding on to certain cards. By trading up, I was able to improve the quality of my collection. This was an extremely valuable lesson that I would carry with me to all my business dealings for the rest of my collecting career. No matter how rewarding it is to collect things that you're passionate about, if you want your collection to grow, you have to be willing to let things go. I was introduced to collecting baseball cards by some of my friends at school. They were really into it, and I wanted to see what all the fuss was about. But this wasn't the first time my friends turned me onto a lucrative business opportunity. I was always looking for ways to make a little extra money to buy supplies for my weird little art projects. For instance, the kids at my school went through a phase where they were really into toothpicks. Sean and I figured out how to make cinnamon-flavored toothpicks. We'd make little packs of them and sell them at school, which was against school rules. For a minute, toothpicks became a big deal at our school. We were basically dealing them like drugs. We never got caught, but eventually the fad wore out. Nothing stays popular forever. Another valuable lesson. Kids stopped buying toothpicks, and we moved to the next thing. For a while, Evan and I sold fake cigarettes that we made at home. These cigarettes weren't meant to be smoked. The tobacco was made out of ground-up leaves that we found in the forest, mixed with various spices from my mother's cupboard. We'd put the cigarettes in old playing card boxes and design them so they looked like real packs of cigarettes. They were purely decorative, but the kids liked them. We sold them fake packs of cigarettes and made a little money. In retrospect, we were probably encouraging underage smoking, but we didn't look at it that way since we were also underage. I got my eye for business opportunities from my father, who loved old, rare cars. If he saw an old car that needed a little TLC, he'd buy it, have it fixed up, and drive it around until another car caught his attention. Then he'd sell the first car at a handsome profit and start the process all over again. The funny thing was, he didn't know all that much about cars. He just liked driving them around and showing them off. He would hire people to fix them up for him. For my dad, the cars were an investment, but it wasn't just about the money. He genuinely loved those old cars, and he had a lot of fun driving them. You can't do that with a stamp collection. My mania for baseball cards was an extension of my dad's entrepreneurial impulse. I learned the value of investing in things that appreciated in value over time. I think my fixation on presentation stems from a desire to enjoy the pieces of my collection for their aesthetic beauty and not stuff them in a box in the back of a closet. My dad taught me that I can be a savvy collector and have fun doing it. I make sure to enjoy my items, but I always remember that they are an investment. Eventually, I must be willing to sell them to make a profit. In my late teens, I sold my entire baseball collection to a card collector in the city. I think I made something like $18,000 on that sale, which at the time was a lot of money for me. In fact, it funded my move to my own apartment in Brooklyn after I graduated from high school. Buying and selling baseball cards taught me how to play the game. I knew I was good at buying low and selling high. I cultivated an eye for things that increased in value and developed a knack for knowing when to sell. Just like in real estate, timing is everything. The opportunity that presents itself today may be gone.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?